Welcome to our interview series, Women in Research. With this interview series, we aim to improve the visibility of women in research and raise awareness about the important work female researchers do in a male-dominated domain. I am Anna Pagani.
And I am Sebastian Akçay.
And we are research assistants at the Collaborative Research Center SFB 884, Political Economy of Reforms at the University of Mannheim. Our first guest is Professor Sabine Carey, Principal Investigator at the SFB and the Chair of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Mannheim. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start our video, could you please introduce yourself to everyone watching this video?
Sure, yeah. So I said my name is Sabine Carey. I'm at the University of Mannheim. I've been here for about 10 years and I research on political violence, different types of human rights violations, repression, and actors of violence, in particular pro-government militias, and also how individuals perceive their rights to be respected.
And let's start with your academic career. I would like to ask you to tell us about how and why you decided to become a researcher.
So I guess one of the main reasons was that I found being able to research new questions, always being able to ask new questions, learn new things is extremely exciting. And the fact that you can sort of always determine what you'd like to answer, what kind of questions you'd like to evaluate, obviously within reason, right? Switching subjects completely would be a bit unrealistic. But overall, I think this is super exciting because there's always something new. There's always new things to learn and to find out. And that's extremely challenging and keeps sort of the routine, boring bits of the job to a minimum. So I think that is very exciting. I also really like the exchange with students. So from the beginning, I knew I didn't just want to do research. So for example, straight after my PhD, I specifically wanted kind of a normal job, not just like a postdoc where you just research. So I could also teach because you also get more feedback quicker in what you do, whether it has some resonance and you can interact and you can see some sort of benefit in other people learning something or finding themselves something interesting out about questions they're interested in, rather than just doing your own research. So I think that is super exciting that you can always have new challenges. I also quite like the fact that it is quite flexible in terms of how you spend your time. So on the one hand, that is positive if you like intend to have a family, which I did and which I do now. So I don't work 9 to 5 normally. So that's kind of an advantage that I'm more flexible. Of course, at the same time, that also has big disadvantages because you're sort of never finished with work and you're kind of constantly juggling how much work can you squeeze in and how much free time can you squeeze out kind of thing. But overall, sort of this flexibility and this great variety of things you can kind of do on the job and a minimal amount of routine, boring things, I find extremely attractive.
You mentioned a little bit, but how did you get where you are now and the important steps of your career? And were there any difficulties you had to overcome? Any moments where you doubted your decision to become a researcher?
Well, I guess I was very lucky throughout. First of all, because I had very supportive supervisors and kind of mentors, all male, by the way, but extremely helpful. So the first time when I really thought about, okay, this could be my career choice, was when I was in the United States at the University of North Texas, and I had a supervisor, Stephen Poe, who I worked with very closely as a research assistant, as a teaching assistant. He was my MA supervisor. We wrote papers together also afterwards. And that was incredibly inspiring because I could see primarily what difference he could make to people's lives, mostly students, but also how interesting his research was. And he had 3 children that he sometimes brought to the office. So I just had kind of a male role model, but still somebody who I could see did the interesting things and managed to have an active family life. And he was incredibly supportive, but also in other supervisors I've had. have always been very supportive also in extending my professional network. I think that was really important. And that I don't think was something that I actively did at the time or was aware of its importance. But I think to a large extent, I connected with the right people at the right time. That was really helpful. I think difficulties, as always, or uncertainties come up when you look for your first job. But again, I was quite lucky that that was pretty smooth for me. Also quite lucky, which is not often the case, that I've always managed to be relatively geographically close to my husband. So that is always a big problem usually in academia. So in that sense, it has actually been quite smooth, which is quite unusual. And I guess in part it has something to do that also when I finished my PhD, I had quite a good CV at the time, for getting a job, but usually that's just not enough. I mean, I think there's always some bit of luck involved as well, which thankfully I had.
And as a successful political scientist, what do you want to achieve in your further career?
I think one of the main things I want to achieve is I want to get better at time management and carve out more free time. I think for probably over a decade, every year, I've sort of set myself a goal of working slightly less and keeping weekends freer. And I think I've failed every single year. So that is still my goal. And I hope that I will actually achieve it one day. That is a big issue. I think since I have the luxury of having a permanent position, which is obviously crucially important, that worry is gone. And there are lots of things I'd like to find out and that sort of thing, but I've also realized that you have to be sort of realistic what you can and want to achieve, because there are always many people who are way better than you. That's just applies to 99.9% of all academics. And at some point you've got to figure out what is kind of your work-life balance that you want to achieve. And there are clearly trade-offs. So I guess naturally I'm quite a sort of ambitious person, also likes to work a lot, which is I guess part of the reason why I managed to get a job in the end. But I think there has to be limits. So there seems to be maybe also enforced more by all social media, this drive that everybody has to be sort of the best or at the best institution, which is empirically simply not possible. And in academia, there's already so much, mostly negative feedback, extremely little positive feedback on the stuff you do, that I think it's important for people to realize what they want out of that job, but also realize it's like a bottomless pit in the sense of how much work you can put in, that at some point that has to stop. So, professionally, there are lots of things I'd still like to find out, and applied for new research grants and new projects. So there are lots of ideas, but also trying to keep in mind that you can't risk working too hard, so you risk just ending up burned out too soon. And just working all day is not really how I envisage my next 10 years. So, like this goal of free weekends and that sort of thing still stands.
You already mentioned that you're interested in conflict processes, human rights violations, regime change, and foreign aid, and you developed an own database, the Pro-Government Militia Database. What are you working on at the moment, and what fascinates you most about your research topic?
Okay, so I'm working slightly different things. So I am still working on this Pro-Government Militia Database and updating it, and that's been a lot of work, but super fascinating to see just what types of groups governments kind of collaborate with in terms of delivering violence and how varied they are, but also that they have very similar patterns. So that's been super interesting finding out more on that. So hopefully very soon. Well, actually now we're starting in new research on these new data. So I'm quite excited about, after many years of collecting the data, finally doing something with it. A newish sort of focus that I've taken on is looking more at how individuals perceive their human rights. So moving away from sort of more objective indicators of how repressive governments are to how do actually individuals perceive that. And I find that extremely fascinating. And we've carried out surveys in 3 post-conflict countries, and almost in all of them, people felt differently about their own security and civil liberties and human rights than objectively we thought they should feel. So that was really interesting to sort of switch the focus from kind of an objective macro level down to the micro level, how that actually is seen by individuals. Because I think that really matters so much more. So I think also in the future we'll focus much more on how individuals perceive these things, because sort of if we look around what's happening in the world, right, individuals are not necessarily driven in their actions by what objectively takes place. They might not vote for what is objectively could be certain developments, but rather how they interpret and see these things, even if they might be completely wrong objectively. So I think focusing on how individuals see their rights respected or not, I find super fascinating, and I will definitely do more of those things.
Okay, I think you already kind of answered our next question to explain your current research project to someone who's not familiar with the subject. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I guess apart from the sort of perception of human rights, newish or another angle that I had recently in a couple of projects is kind of the role of the media, which I find also super interesting. So for many years now, I've been working with actually a former PhD student of mine on why journalists are killed. And we found out that actually by far almost the vast majority of journalists are actually killed in very democratic regimes, which seems super puzzling. So we tried to figure out more why they're killed in democracies. And then in a different project, we looked at whether governments react more repressively to protest or to terror attacks, for example, if they can control the media or not. So I think the media plays a really big role in kind of modifying how governments react, under what conditions and what kind of violence they can use. So as a sort of a newish angle in my work, but I think that's something that plays a big role in trying to understand repression, human rights violations.
You're studying violent conflicts and peace for about 20 years now. What was your greatest achievement or the moment you've been most proud of yourself and your research?
So I think what is very prominent in my memory as sort of a big achievement for me at the time was certainly, which is probably the case for a lot of people, my first 2 publications. They both came from my MA thesis. And at the time with my first MA thesis, I have 2 MAs, and with my first MA thesis, I submitted it to my supervisor and he said, oh, why don't you make an article out of this? And I had never thought of that in a million years, that would possibly be an option. And I did that fairly quickly, and unusual for this process, it also got accepted reasonably quickly. And that also, to me, felt a pretty big achievement. And it was, I think, very important for me at that stage. And the same happened with my second MA thesis. And then the other thing is maybe the pro-government militias database that I've been working on with a colleague of mine, still working on, simply because it's been the project I have been working on by far the longest, for well over a decade. So I guess the amount of time it's taken us working on this relative to the output is maybe not a good ratio there, but just because how much time it's taken, it feels like quite the achievement. And I'm really happy with the output that we have so far. So I've provided a database, and a new database will be coming soon with really an enormous amount of detail on pro-government militias, that can then be used by other scholars and non-scholars alike.
I want to continue with the main focus of our interview. Do you think that the challenges you face are different to those of your male colleagues? And if yes, in which aspect?
So I think it is a bit different. It also depends a little bit on which country you're in. So I think I was really lucky that I started off outside of Germany, in the UK, where I think it's slightly more balanced. So you have more women in academia, you have more female professors, more so than in Germany. So when the first time I noticed this big difference was when I moved, and quite a lot of, especially young female scholars, said, oh, it's great to have a female professor as children. And I had that comment a lot, and nobody ever said that to me in the UK, just because it was not that unusual in the UK, but a lot more unusual in Germany. So I think the fact that we have more female professors who also happen to have a family is hopefully sending a signal that, you know, it is possible. I think one of the big differences, and I think that's less country specific, is that you have different starting conditions if you start as somewhere new as a man or as a woman. I think if you start as a man, you usually get quite a positive feedback, and everybody assumes from the word get-go that, you know, you can do your job, you're really good, you're there because, you know, you should be, and you've worked for it, and you've got everything it takes to do that job. You can, of course, lose that over time, but I think you start off with sort of a lot of credit on that you can do what you do. I think that is different for women. I think for women, it's much, the attitude seems to be more like, well, let's see whether she can actually do this job. So I think you have to do a lot more in the beginning to prove that you can do it, and, you know, you are right in this job. Whereas for men, they can lose that goodwill. For women, I think you have to earn it. I guess the good news is that you can earn it. It just takes some time. And so I think that the starting point is quite different. Another big difference is that, I mean, thankfully, we're now at the stage where we realize we should have women represented on various committees, like search committees or, you know, any other kind of committees. So, you know, we need to have women represented in those groups, but we have very few female professors, not just at our university, also at other universities. And if you then require full professors to be at committees, that means, of course, they have to show up at many more committees than their male colleagues, or have other kind of tasks. And that, of course, massively increases the workload that female academics have, especially, you know, if they sort of climb up higher the ranks, meaning less work for the thing that most academics value more, which is research and research output. So on the one hand, you have the positive development that people realize you should have women represented in various committees. But since we're still at this stage, there are very few women, and those women who are there kind of get tagged on a lot more, which, you know, increases more time constraints and more pressures than I think on average for male colleagues. Again, doesn't obviously apply to everybody.
Now you already talked about the representation of women in research, and I would like to ask, how did you deal with this different starting point? Did you feel treated unfairly at the beginning of your career?
I think I was always quite lucky. So when I was a student, a PhD student, and then started off, I think it was far more male dominated than it is now. And so I was very used to that. And also all my supervisors, and I would say also like mentors and important academics in my academic career, they were all men, but extremely supportive men. So, and because I was always used to the fact that I would sit in a room full of men, I didn't even notice, and that didn't really bother me that much, because again, at the time, nobody was aware that much of it. I remember one time sitting in a committee of a grant steering committee, and I looked around the room of, I think, almost 30 people, and I was the only woman apart from the secretary. Now, obviously, you know, you notice that a lot more, and you try and have that not happen again. So for me personally, it didn't seem that strange. The bigger issue, I think, also when you start having children, then it's harder to convince others that even though you decide to have children, you're still serious about your job. And I think that is a big difference. So my impression is now that when men have children and they take leave or whatever, then everybody thinks, oh, this is great. It's such a modern man. They help out. They take time for their family. It seems like it's a positive attribute and valued as such. For women, in my experience, and it's not like that. It's more like, oh, she's not really serious anymore anyway. So I think my, let's say, more negative experiences are really more linked, I think, to the fact that I have children. I think, I mean, it could also be that I'm pretty oblivious to a lot of things because I'm just so used to being around mostly men throughout my whole career, that it's just kind of, it was always normal for me that there are not that many women around.
Apart from that, have you ever experienced or have been confronted with inappropriate or unprofessional behavior?
Yes, I think most women probably have. I think it's getting less now. I think even in Germany, which I think is a bit slow to catch on, people realize more and more what is clearly politically incorrect behavior or things that they might say. And I think people are getting more careful in what they say. And I think that's obviously excellent, right? We can't always change how they think, which is, you know, fair enough. They might think whatever they want, but what they then vocalize is something different. But I think that is changing. I think there's less of that now. That's
a quite personal question, but how did you deal with it in the situation?
Getting really angry. I mean, in some instances, when I was still quite junior, you know, if you get comments about your clothes and your wardrobe that's completely inappropriate, I think usually, or in my I was just so baffled at first that you can't possibly say anything back because you just think, where's that comment coming from? Yes, I think it's probably better to kind of raise these issues, but again, it's a very fine line, I think. So on the one hand, it's important to point out that that's just not correct. On the other hand, I think those people who voice these comments, you can't really convince them anyway that what they're doing is wrong. And then that's just like, oh, it's just some hypersensitive women who can't deal with normal banter or whatever. So it's kind of tricky. And I think especially if you're junior, and you might get these comments from people that are senior to you and you might possibly depend on for jobs or your salary. That is a very tricky situation. I think the only way out is that you then turn to an external third party, like all universities now have, and try and raise the issue via that way, because doing it directly in a relationship where you're dependent on that person is, I think, extremely difficult and just, again, puts the pressure on the woman even more to try and kind of fix the problem. So I think going through institutionalized channels is probably the better option.
Collaborative Research Center, SFB 884, provides different measures to support women and working parents, such as the childcare during SFB conferences, as well as coaching and mentoring program? Have you benefited one of these messages?
Not personally, because now my kids are a bit older, but I think it's really an excellent program. And there is so much support within the SFB that is not often available outside of it. And I think that's a big plus, particularly and for young researchers who have, well, I guess like anybody, lots of time constraints and might be struggling with this. Some of these, but not necessarily from the SFB, but in general, are limited to junior scholars. Some of these benefits, you know, the childcare, for example. And people who are not junior scholars anymore, but might still have children, like it was in my case, you might not qualify for some of them. So I think it's great that there is this support. And I think it's probably also right that the majority focus is on junior scholars. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there might also be other scholars in need for the exact same support. Again, thankfully in my case, the kids are older now, and you know, with family backup, you know, that works. But not everybody might be in that lucky situation like I am. So I think because there's so few full female professors with children, it's obvious that it's not in the front of people's minds that they might need some support. But I think also that is changing slowly. So, and I think that will also adjust. And I think within the SFB, you know, that is probably the best possible support I've sort of come across anywhere to try and make it feasible that you can combine both.
And we don't want to discourage young female students through some bad experiences in our interviews. And what advice would you give to female students who want to pursue a career in science, a domain that is still dominated by men?
Well, I think the first advice would be to pursue and to just stick with it. I mean, of course, everybody has to weigh up, you know, what are they worth sacrificing, what are they worth taking on, you know, how does it fit with their own preferences in terms of work-life styles. But if they really want to pursue it, they should just do it, basically. And then it also helps if they have a network of, I think, also friends or on like the same level network that they can turn to. But also I think it does help if they have a network that includes also more senior individuals. In parts of they can see there are people who have made it and, you know, it was fine. But also that they, you know, could turn to with questions and things. So I've been at lots of events with like mentorship or advice for junior female scholars on all kinds of different things. And that is always extremely well received. And I think that does help because yeah, there are often questions that it's difficult for them to ask their peers. And then to be able to exchange or ask questions and exchange experiences, I think is incredibly valuable and also helps maybe put things in perspective. I think that should really help. But I definitely think pursuing things is really, really important. So for example, I've been on many, many search committees and by now we really do look and try and employ female scholars, but it's really difficult because at the application stage for jobs, there are already at that stage very few women. So we have a lot of students, BA, MA, but then after the MA, it starts to break off. And then even after the PhD, it's even worse. So there's something, you know, this leaky pipeline starts really, really early where women start dropping out. And I just think if women want to pursue it, they should just really try and find the support that they need and personal contacts that might help them. I think there is by now an improved institutional support, but not everybody feels comfortable with just institutional support and it's not enough. So I think trying to establish a network is really important. And there are more things, like for example, the SFB organized a conference on can't remember exactly what the topic was, but it was not on mentoring, it was on substantive, on a research topic, but it was for women only. And occasionally you find these events that are focused on some substantive research topic, but only for women. And I think that's very useful because, you know, women feel in a bit more protected environment. They don't have to prove themselves over and over and over that, you know, they really should be there. And they can extend their network among other female colleagues or junior, senior, whatever. So these kinds of events, if people can, you know, engage in those, I think that's really useful and helps and supports people and women if they want to pursue this career.
Professor Carey, thank you for your time and sharing your valuable insights and experiences with us.
You're very welcome.